people in the room and people online. And welcome to today's CSH workshop, which is also the last workshop of this year and is entitled Energy and Inequality. For those who do not know me, my name is David Singh, and I'm a researcher at CSH here and also co-convener of the CSH seminar and workshop series with Corinne Lefebvre. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker of the day, Lucas Chancel. Lucas Chancel is a tenured associate professor of economics at Sciences Po, affiliated with the Center of Social Inequalities and the Department of Economics. And he's also co-director and senior economist at the World Inequality Lab. Lucas' research sits at the intersection of economic inequality, climate energy transitions, public policy, with a strong focus on how to measure inequality and transition. His work has been very prolific, and I will just cite a few of them. He has been the author of a book called Unsustainable Inequalities, Social Justice and the Environment in 2020. And he's also a regular contributor to the World Inequality Reports, including, if I'm not wrong, the one for 2026. Today, Lucas is joining us to discuss insight from his latest book, which is entitled in French, Énergie et inégalités, une histoire politique, or in English, Energy and Inequality, a political history. This book is a sweeping, historically grounded account of how energy systems are shaped by politics and power, and how, in return, they reshape social hierarchies and inequalities. In this book that Lucas will present today, Lucas argues that energy is not a physical quantity or a physical entity, but it is a deeply social and political matter. Controlling energy can be a vehicle for emancipation, but also can strengthen authoritarian forms of power. And the questions that Lucas raises in his book are also central to our interest here at CSH, which is mostly about who owns energy, who decides its use, and in whose interests. So for those who have been with us also yesterday, you will notice that there has been a slight energy bias this week. A lot of energy topic happening here. Yesterday, we had Jean-Baptiste Fressos, who talked about the role of technology and technophilia in climate expertise and how this shapes how energy transition looks like today. And today, Lucas will place the question of property, the question of capital and control at the heart of the energy transition, showing us how different political arrangements can have different implications for democracy, for justice, and for inequality. So for us here in India, a country that is battling with the effects of climate change, the challenges of a just energy transition, and a country where coal still plays a central role, and where the economy has been described by many scholars as a form of crony capitalism, I think that the questions Lucas is raising in his book are extremely important also for us here on this part of the world. So we are very delighted to host you today, Lucas. Thanks a lot for coming and visit us. So you'll have about 40 to 45 minutes to present your book, and we will follow that by Q&A. Lucas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you, Odile, and thank you, Niro, and thank you to all those who made this presentation possible. It was not so easy. So I'm really happy to be here and also to see faces that I know in the room. So it feels really nice. I was just before presenting the World Inequality Report that you just mentioned at GNU, and we released the World Inequality Report last week. But this is a more personal solo book. The World Inequality Report is a large research enterprise that regroups the work, synthesizes the work of 200 researchers, and that focuses on global inequality. And in this work, I focus more on the interaction between inequality and the environment, and more particularly inequality and energy. And so I love that you have an energy bias this week. I think it's really great. I would have also been really delighted to discuss with Jean-Baptiste Fressos, and we did actually debate 2 months ago. And you'll see that there are things on which we are fully aligned, and others on which we may have some interesting points of discussion. If we can pick it up from where it stopped yesterday or 2 days ago, or a few days ago, I think that's going to be really, really interesting. So, Nero, how do you want me to give you a little sign? And so this is an economic and political history of energy regimes. And it's the first history of energy through the lens of inequality. And what I found is really the diversity of means of control and of ownership of energy systems over time and space. And what was really interesting is how forms of controls and ownership of energy really impact the social and the ecological world we live in. And so this is a particular moment of world history where we need to radically overhaul our energy systems. And so we need to replace what I will call energy capital. So all the infrastructures, the technologies that allow us to use energy. And I will also argue that even if we might be skeptical of technophilia, as Jean-Baptiste Fresso's maybe, rightly, I think, it's still very important to think about infrastructures, technologies, and who controls them, because those who controls them control society. And maybe one way to illustrate this directly, to get straight into the topic, so Nero, is this example. Why does owning energy capital matter? Because it determines supply options. It determines what kind of energy system we live in and how we're going to use it. And this is a very interesting example of the 1940s. It's known as the American streetcar scandal. And basically, in the first part of the 20th century, there were alternatives to private individual cars in the United States. In fact, there were several cities where you had a public transportation system, an electric streetcar system, which actually was not really to some competitors didn't like this way to use energy for transportation. And those who didn't like that, well, they were the car industry and the oil industry. And so the Standard Oil of California and General Motors, along with another set of fossil energy conglomerates, did a deal together, a secret alliance, to buy back these streetcar industries and to make them crash, to make them go bankrupt. And so what you see here is the old Pacific electric cars piled up like toys at a junkyard awaiting dismantling to become scrap metal, from the LA Times, March 19th, 1956. So the Standard Oil of California and General Motors and the other companies that participated in this illegal alliance were fined in the early 1950s, but that was too late. The streetcar systems were gone forever until now in these cities. You still have a few left, for instance, in San Francisco. If you go to San Francisco, you see there's one streetcar for tourists mostly. But the general point is that once this was dismantled, the only alternative was the private car. And this contributed to shaping the US transportation system for decades, using cars even in city centers. And so that's an illustration of how owning energy capital. So here, the capital is the technology that transforms energy into something that moves, the streetcar, transforms electricity here into something that moved. Owning the industry, owning the capital itself was key to have an influence over mobility choices over decades after that in the United States. And my key argument is that, in fact, we're going to see this with many, many forms of energy devices or energy technologies or energy capital. And so it's so important today to think about these important questions of who owns what, to serve what objectives, to decarbonize what sectors of society. And I think the energy question is often seen as a purely technology question. In fact, it's very much a question of control, of power, of who owns what, to serve what interests. And so that's the story that I'm looking at. And so the next slide is this this important figure of the energy world. His name is Matthew Boulton, late 18th century. Matthew Boulton is first the son of a rich man. He inherited a lot of money. He was also a brilliant engineer, but also very much known for his investments. And in fact, he's going to invest in a weird technology at the time that creates movement out of steam. And this weird technology that is really not well known is the Watt steam engine. And he's going to buy the part of the patent of Watt, of James Watt, who at that point of time is struggling in financial difficulties. Matthew Boulton buys the part of the patent, so they're going to become associate, and they are going to commercialize and produce the first industrial steam engines. And Matthew Boulton says this very important line, and some of you may have heard of it. He says that he sells, talking about the steam engines, what the entire world desires: power. And so he's playing on the double meaning of the word power, the mechanical power that is generated by the steam engine. That is a revolution in the world of energy, but also the economic, social, and political power that is associated with owning it, with having this technology. And so what I try to do in this research, in this book, is really try to understand what actually he means since the steam engine to now, but actually I went even further back in time. And I'm starting at the discovery of fire. I was quite interested also by what archaeologists and some anthropologists would say about how the discovery of fire and who controls fire and what this can change to the organization of human groups. When you have a new source of energy, how human interactions, social interactions might change with a new source of energy. I'm not going to talk about pre-industrial societies in this part of in this discussion, in the interest of time, but happy to maybe answer some questions about that, or much more is in the book. And if we can go to the next slide. And so that's the manufacture of Boulton and Watt in Solo, Birmingham, where he says this line on power. And then the next slide. And a key question, of course, is it's looking at this history to try to better understand what might be the impacts of the choices we make today when it comes to energy control and new ownership, or the choices we don't make, actually. And so I'll go to the next slide. And one question is really, is decarbonization, could it be a big boon for billionaires? And I'll show later that, in fact, today we need to completely reshape our energy system. And some actors actually have a lot of cash to invest in these energy systems. Governments have little capacities in many countries. And there's a lot, and we were discussing this just an hour ago at GNU, there's a lot of private wealth out there. This is a characteristic of modern, this phase of capitalism is the rise of private wealth and the concentration of private wealth. So some people say, well, we need to make all these investments. Maybe it should be those guys. And in fact, some of those guys, if we go to the next slide, some of those guys, like Mr. Bill Gates, are investing in low carbon technologies. So this is Mr. Bill Gates at the middle with the blue shirt, inaugurating TerraPower. That's a nuclear power company in Camera Desert in Wyoming 2 years ago. And he has a plan to save planet Earth. After what he claims to have done on issues of global health, Mr. Bill Gates is now, he wants to save the world with nuclear technology. And he's invested hundreds of millions of dollars in that. And in fact, he's not the only one. Next slide. Because Mr. Elon Musk also has a plan, and that's called the Sustainable Energy for all of Earth. It's not for all on Earth, you'll see. But it's a plan to basically cover the entire world with solar panels, with electric battery systems, and basically solve the carbon problem basically just with technology, with no room for democratic deliberation, and with very little concern, if not at all, for social justice or injustices that may come up with this plan. But what's quite important to have in mind is that they do have a relatively clear plan. Now, tech billionaires in the US, they need a lot of energy these days for data centers and for AI. And in fact, in the United States, electricity prices have gone up by 20% in some places because of the AI energy boom in demand. And in fact, spot prices, so that's the prices on markets, not for the final consumers, but between distributors of energy, spot prices in some cases have increased by more than 1,000%. So there's a huge increase in demand for AI related needs. And in fact, I was talking about Tesla here, Gates and Microsoft, but also Amazon, Facebook are investing massively in energy solutions to power the AI data centers, including nuclear power options. So in fact, that's Microsoft again that has invested in a nuclear reactor that is just in front, in the same site, just in front of the one that led to the 3 Mile Island catastrophe in 1979. So they have a plan, right? But other actors have a plan, and that's the next slide. In fact, the other forms of powerful people or elites have had a plan for a much longer time, actually. If you look at 5-year plans of China since the 1980s, they understood the importance of decarbonization and of becoming leaders of the world energy system. And so they've been planning the current leadership that China has on solar panels, on electric batteries, on electric cars, and on a big part of the low carbon ecosystem, industrial ecosystem, has been planned very rigorously over the past 30 years. And so decarbonization can be an opportunity for these actors to concentrate potentially even more power. And then the next slide. But what is interesting when we look at energy systems is that we see, in fact, a diversity of modes of control of energy. And this is just one example. It's the Some Energia cooperative in Spain, where investment decisions and power decision within this cooperative are based on the one person, one vote principle, not on the $1, one vote principle. So that's the kind of opposite way to organize investments in energy, to organize how we're going to think about what are going to be the prices at which people access energy, how to think about discussions of whether we're going to get more solar panels or maybe a little bit more gas to fuel our electricity generations or other sources of energy, or are we going to help our users reduce their energy consumption, which is really what rich countries need to do. And so again, the current situation is in fact quite open in terms of all these modes of control of energy. And this is what I'm looking at in this book. And so the next slide. So key questions: how has energy shaped inequality through history? How have countries and time periods differed in terms of energy control? And how could the energy transition reshape the map of wealth inequalities within and between countries? Next slide. I'll just give here a quick overview of the chapters, so you can see where I come from, where I go in the book, and then I'll just focus on a subset of them. So the first is energy and climate, a few key or basic facts. Chapter 2 is a bit more conceptual, what I call by inequality and energy regimes, a key concept that I'm going to use and mobilize throughout this work. And then the next slide. Chapter 3, that's the more long-run focus on energy, where I look at pre-industrial societies and go back to to even pre-Neolithic revolution societies and their relation with energy. Chapter 4 is how organic societies, so societies that are essentially going to use energy through the use of photosynthesis that generates agricultural calories and that generates wood for heating purposes, how these societies are very much constrained in their organizations because of some key energy limitations. Chapter 5 is when fossil energy comes in, but I'm revisiting the Industrial Revolution and the role of energy in this Industrial Revolution, very much in line with the work of an author like Kenneth Pomeranz. So mobilizing global history here to show that this Industrial Revolution is a moment where you have very much a combination or a symbiosis. So here I'm also discussing with Fressoz, who also uses the term symbiosis, not necessarily with this perspective, but here I see a symbiosis between muscular energy, that is the energy of constrained and slavery workforce in the colonies that are essential for the energy revolution of the Industrial Revolution to take place. Because you cannot have the manufacturers in Birmingham producing that amount of cotton or textile products if you don't have the production of the raw materials and the industrial energy that go with it. And so really symbiosis from this perspective. Then in chapter 6, I move on to what I call fossil regimes. So how societies progressively incorporated in different manners fossil energies in their energy systems, in their economies. And chapter 7 really focuses on who owns these energy systems. And I'm going to take quite a bit of time looking at the conflicts over control of energy and showing that it can really play out in different directions. And so that's for me the core of the argument is going to be here. These different ways to own, to control energy are going to create specific form of inequalities, which I've worked on quite a bit in my earlier work. And this is what I call climate inequalities. And so inequalities in pollution. Who pollutes what amount of energy, and how this is related to class and to wealth inequality. And in fact, chapter 8 is the end point of a lot of work that I've done in the past. And I realized that this kind of work was looking at things from the very end of the pipe. So basically, I was looking at, emissions of the richest 10% in society or at the global level. And so I think this is quite interesting. But if you really want to understand how do you produce a society where the richest 10% emit 50% of all emissions, you want to better understand what's coming at the beginning of the pipe. And that's what I'm discussing here. And then chapters 9, 10, and 11 are going to be related to the growth and degrowth discussion. And in fact, how ownership and control of energy is really related to our ability to degrow, in fact. But I'm also saying that we don't necessarily focus on the right indicators. Basically, I don't think we should take so much time to discuss the growth or degrowth of GDP. I don't think it's a good indicator for these discussions. Although we indeed necessarily need to reduce material consumption flows in rich countries. Chapter 10 is how do we do this? And so it's discussion of, market failures and economic planning. And here I'm going to look at how China engineered their leadership on decarbonization sectors. And I show that what they do is not related to the nature of their political system. They very much, in fact, basically copied a lot of the economic policy instruments that you see in Western Europe in the 60s, 70s, and you see in the US at the same time. So for those countries who would want to accelerate their energy transitions, well, they can actually look at what China is doing, or maybe if you're a European country, look back at what you were doing maybe 40 or 50 years ago in terms of industrial policy planning. And the 11th chapter is related to what I've just said, because it's related to the democratic question. And I think there's a growing argument in countries, in a country like the US or in France, which says, we will never manage to crack this because we're democracies, because it takes such a long time, in fact, to transform radically our energy systems. You need a authoritarian rule in order to move forward. And the argument here that I develop is that actually you don't. But it's not going to be simple. And inequality reduction is going to be at the heart of what you need to do. And so let me move forward and just let me know how am I doing on time? 20? Okay, great. And so in a nutshell, getting straight into graphs. So this is a book that's written for an interested general audience, and I'm trying to bring every reader to describe, take time to describe every graph, but there's quite a bit of graph. I think I have over 90 graphs. So you need to like graphs, or you need to be ready to be accompanied through liking graphs. And so I think this one represents a bit, illustrates one of the key arguments. So what you see here is, time, so 1900 to 2025. And on the vertical axis, it's the share of electricity that is controlled, that is owned by government or cooperative actors. Okay, so the closest you are to the top, this means the highest share of government and or cooperative ownership you have in your total electricity supply. And so if you're close to the bottom, it means that 0%, everything is privatized. And what you see is the trajectories of the US, France, UK, India, China over the past century and up to now. And you see a diversity of pathways. You see countries like France, the US, that start with very little public or cooperative ownership. France going to get to close to 100%. The US, 30% today. You have countries like the UK that start relatively high, that go even higher, and that drop completely to 0% or close to 0%. India, progressive rise, close to 100% of electricity production under government-owned or state-owned enterprises, and the reduction over the recent period. China, another pattern. So a diversity of ownership pattern, which really show that energy control is a political choice. And you can't say that, it's because of economic laws, or it's because of we have a certain energy mix, for instance, that needs to be controlled in a certain way. This is sometimes an argument you hear in France. You say nuclear technology needs a lot of centralization. So that's why you have state control. But in fact, you have privatized nuclear technology in Japan, and you have privatized nuclear technology in the US. So again, this is very much, in fact, a political choice, a political decision. And I'll go to the next slide. And so here, another long time frame. So 1820s, the left of the graph, and 2025 today. And here I'm not looking at forms of control. I'm looking at how much energy you use. And the metric is the kilowatt hour per person per day. So that's the unit on your electricity bill, kilowatt hour per person per day. In USA, Western Europe, China, India, Russia, Central Asia, South Africa. And what you see is, USA is very much at the very top of the league, nothing surprising. But again, you see another diversity of levels of energy consumption. You see that Western Europe, China, Russia, and Central Asia consume more or less the same amount of energy today, but they have very different energy mixes. You also see that there's been a reduction in per capita energy use. I think that's also quite important to have in mind, especially related to the transition or no transition discussion that you may have had with Jean-Baptiste Fressoz when he came. So there is some diversity of patterns. There is a reduction in per capita energy use over the past 20 years, which is a relatively good news, although we need a much more radical decrease in energy consumption in order to face the climate challenge. But what I'm going to argue is that what happens here, so that's the material way to look at things, right? These are physical units, is very much determined by our social or economic control variables that I was presenting in the previous graph. And so the next slide is a summary of what I've just said. Energy is not just a techno-physical reality. It's a total, I call this total social facts. Controlling energy means controlling energy rents, controlling wealth inequality generations, as well as controlling uses of energy. And this relates to the streetcar example I was showing before. Energy has always been central to inequality making, from the discovery of fire to social panel. And in fact, and that's what I'm going to discuss today, fierce economic and political conflict to control energy production and consumption, in particular since the 19th century, with a vast diversity of outcomes, monopoly control under private ownership, nationalization, municipalization of energy, cooperative forms of energy. They've all been there for all the different types of energy that we can think about. And this had different impacts on the social political inequality which we can observe. So if we want to understand properly inequality, we also need to understand energy. And the current period is characterized by renewed conflict over energy control. And I think it's there, but it's not really seen that it's there. We may think about it from a geopolitical perspective, but much less so from a within-country inequality perspective. And the outcome of these conflicts will redefine global inequality and human ability to decarbonize in the 21st century. So let me maybe continue with just a few, if we can go to the next slide. What are energy regimes? Then a few key facts connecting inequality and climate, why it's important. Then looking at some examples of redistribution through what I will call socialization. So taking away energy control from private actors and placing it under different forms of non-private actors. So that can be national state actors, that can be regional municipal actors, or that can be cooperatives. And so let's move to the next slide. And again. And so to summarize the discussion, we have actors. An energy regime is defined by actors. So we have our Bill Gates on the top left corner. We have potential cooperators. We have state actors. We have investors. We've seen these figures before. And then next slide. That are going to compete over control for resources and capital. And then the next slide. And that will, sorry for the lack of translation. This is the second conference I do today. And I was finalizing the slides in the plane earlier today. So apologies if I'm a little slow or if a few slides are not 100% translated, but you're going to compete over ownership, over managing, over regulation or influence of energy systems. And what the picture you see is the National Coal Board right after the nationalization of mines in the UK. 1946-47. You have a share of Standard Oil Company, and you have regulatory agencies, for instance, in the US. So different ways to control. It's not just about ownership, but I will focus essentially on ownership because of its central role, both for controlling energy and for social inequalities more broadly. And so next slide is a little diagram of all that. Our actors, through different forms of controls, are controlling energy assets, which bring, and that's why it's so important, energy services, which are essential for societies to function. And so the next slide is, I'm going to draw from different strands of work on energy history to produce this first history of energy through inequality. So Smil, Václav Smil, an engineer that focuses a lot on the history of energy, but he's going to do this through a purely or essentially techno-physical focus. So politics, social sciences, political economy is largely missing from the analysis. There are other very interesting actors, fossil capital, for instance, written by Malm, or carbon democracy by Mitchell, or Jean-Baptiste Fressoz, looking at social political forces that shape energy. What I'm going to bring in here is a quantitative dimension. And I think it's very interesting to have some dialogue between what I would call more qualitative accounts, historical accounts as they do, and attempts to quantify things. because you can a little bit more easily, I think, with the quantification, understand what's big, what's important, what's less important, and also have an account of potential changes in trends, potential transitions, or lack of transitions. And then you have some economic history of energy by Wrigley, important, prolific English author, Kander, Malanima, and Wordy, but which I think is largely not looking at the inequality dimension. So I'm trying to combine these strands of work and add really the inequality focus. And so the next slide. I'm going to skip the data part. If you're interested in it, there's a 179 pages data appendix. And so the next slide, and happy to ask any question on that afterwards. The next slide. So a few key facts on energy and climate. So current levels of CO2 concentrations are unseen in the past 800,000 years. So that's the concentration in CO2 in parts per million. And you see that, there's this oscillation in CO2 concentrations, but never have we seen such an increase and at this speed. And so the next slide, I'm going to zoom over the past 8,000 years. So the previous slide was 800,000. This is 8,000 years. And we see this stability of CO2 concentrations basically since the Neolithic Revolution. So everything we developed as human societies since the Neolithic Revolution really happened through a very stable CO2 environment. This is also why I'm starting so way back in time. I think it's very important to also try to understand these trends from the very long perspective. But so very strong, fast increase in CO2 concentrations over the past 150 years. And then the next slide. Why is energy central to that? So these are CO2 emissions by source. Billion tons of CO2, gigatons of CO2 equivalents. So this is CO2 emissions. There's a bit of the total that is not represented here, CO2 equivalents. So again, this is CO2. So some gases like methane are not here, but you have the bulk of it, around 43 gigatons in 2025. Add around 7 extra gigatons if you want to have the total CO2 equivalent, a little bit more than 50 gigatons. But so if you focus on CO2, you have the bulk of it, and the bulk of it is going to be coming from, the bulk of the bulk is coming from energy sources, coal, oil, and gas. Also very important to have in mind the yellow wedge at the bottom. This is deforestation and land use. It's a very high contributor to historical emissions, from 25 to 30%, depending on how we count things. And this is part of the energy system of pre-industrial societies. So again, this is energy, but not fossil energy. And then the next slide. Another important fact directly related to the discussion with Jean-Baptiste Fressoz. So here I'm back to looking at how much energy people use. I'm back to using kilowatt hours per person and per day. So that's the average human. Every day, they use around 65 kilowatt hours per person, up from around 10 kilowatt hours in 1820. And what you see here is how the different colors stack up one on top of the other. So you discover coal, and then you discover oil, and then you discover gas, and you don't reduce your initial consumption of coal. You don't reduce your initial consumption of gas and of oil. So that's the no transition narrative. And this is very much true at the global level. But what I show in the book, maybe I won't spend so much time and I will skip this set of slides, so I'm going to say it right now, is that in fact, when we look at different countries, there's a much more diverse picture. So in fact, you do see some elements of transition at the country level. And so it's important to look at the global level because this is what the planet actually feels and see. But if you want to think about the future, it's also important to have in mind this diversity of patterns that you're going to observe within countries, because this shows potentially what can be done, potentially extended to other countries. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide. And so that's the last fact, important fact number 4. The fossil energy system is extremely inefficient. And that's a rather positive news, I think, in the end, because it's so inefficient, it can create some efficiencies if we go out of it. So I'm not a naive believer in economic efficiency, and I think you need a lot of planning and of political choices to change from one system to another. But I think the fact that the fossil regime is so inefficient, so basically you lose more than half of the primary energy, of the raw energy that you are mobilizing, you lose more than half between what you use, what you mobilize, and how much energy you're going to use because of fossil fuel inefficiencies. And this basically means that if you change your energy system, you can increase the efficiency of all that, and you can create the same level of energy service for people with much less energy mobilization to start with. So that's the fact number 4. Okay, and now I have 10 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to move to the heart of the book, redistribution and socialization of energy. And before that, just one graph, which is a long-term graph on inequality. A lot of what I'm going to say is connected to inequality, of course. This graph shows us energy inequalities between countries. So this is from year 1000 to 2025. How much how much gap there is between the countries who use the most energy and the bottom 50% of countries. So basically between 1000 and 1500, the top 10% of countries consume, 50% more energy maximum than the bottom half of countries in the world. This gap rises to factor 16 after the Industrial Revolution and the colonial period. And it dropped to around factor 8 today. So we still live in a world where there's, a very large level of inequalities between countries that use the most energy and the bottom 50% energy. I call this the top 10 to bottom 50% energy use ratio. Okay, so that was just the global inequality graph, and now let's look at what's happening within countries. So the next slide is what I've already presented, so I'm not gonna take so much time to discuss this more. So I'm gonna skip directly to why have countries followed these different paths, and that's the next slide. So basically, when you look, and that's what I'm trying to do, it's parliamentary debates, political platforms in Western Europe, in the US, in India, and I'm also looking at China. So why is there this importance of reclaiming control over energy, equalize access to basic services? You want to decommodify energy because when it's in the hands of the private sector, starting with electricity in the first part of the 20th century, well, political leaders realize that not everybody has access to it. Rural areas are disconnected from the grid. They can't access it. It's too expensive for private actors. So they say to expand the electricity networks. And when it does, the tariffs are way too high. And so, for instance, someone like Roosevelt is going to be very angry at private energy utilities or private utilities in general, and he's going to criticize their evil traits. He's going to talk of them in very strong language, and he's going to say, okay, I want to either nationalize you or put energy in the hands of municipalities or of cooperatives. So Roosevelt, in fact, I don't even think he really wants to have an entirely federally owned system. He just wants to control the private sector. And he wants to do this in several ways. Federalize the part of energy. So basically nationalize. We'll see this with the Tennessee Valley authorities. You take, some actually private energy producers, nationalize them, and then construct these big dams. He's going to support municipalities to also buy their own small energy power plants. And he's going to support cooperatives to also access some capital and through some regulations so that they can also buy and create their own small energy systems. Energy cooperatives still exist today in the US. And actually, they serve several millions of US consumers in the lowest income areas of the countries. And this is a legacy of the New Deal, in fact. So these actors that want to socialize energy, they also want to reduce wealth inequality, very afraid of the private sector's controlling, capturing energy rents. They want to limit monopoly power. And some of them will also want to do economic planning. And that's also, another very important part of the dimension, which I think is relevant to today's discussion, because countries today, they need to radically overhaul their energy system. They need to plan their industries. And so basically to do this economic planning, several countries in the 20th century, that's precisely why they also socialize energy. And so the next slide. And in fact, since the late 19th century, many actors have, contributed to debates with their own ways to think about this socialization. So French socialists, for instance, Jaurès, Gued, Millerand, they want to socialize mines, and they want to do it with really minimum compensation of private owners. These ideas are going to become progressively more mainstream. So by the 1920s in the UK, in fact, it's a parliamentary designated commission that says, okay, we need to socialize mines. At the time, they say it's essentially to correct market failures or inefficiencies. But in fact, what was seen initially as these radical socialist ideas is going to progressively become central in parliamentary debates. This line of William Brace, MP in 1920 in the House of Commons, talking about British coal, I could never believe that God placed in the bowels of the earth the coal for the benefit of less than 4,000 people out of the 45 millions of this country. So talking very much about how to spread ownership of energy at home, not thinking about what is happening in India or in the rest of the empire. So that's also a contradiction, as we know, of these members of the political spectrum in the UK or in France, by the way. But there's a progress of the discourse on what to do with energy. And Roosevelt, I talked about him earlier. I'm going to skip to the next slide. And then, so we talked about that, different forms of energy. And then the next slide is basically a summary table. Is just, you have on the column on the left is different forms of energy. Capital, what I call energy capitals. You have resources, you have extraction technologies, you have energy to transform energy, you have energy to distribute, or you have use technologies. What I just want to show with this graph is that you have all these types of actors that I mentioned before, private investors, states, local authorities, cooperative, they've all owned at some point of time or in some country one type of energy resource or energy capital. So I think, that's the diversity that I'm talking about, and I'm going to discuss much more at length in the book. And in the interest of time, let's move on. Just a few pictures. So that's when the UK nationalizes coal from one day to the next, just with a line of paper. Tennessee Valley Authority, that's the US partial nationalization of the electricity system. The next slide shows, well, you can nationalize, and of course you can then privatize. So very much opposite movement in the UK in the late 1980s. Sorry for the legend, but so investor-owned firms is in blue, and government-owned firms is in orange. In France, for instance, that's the next slide. There's a shift to government-owned coal ownership. So I'm looking at different forms: electricity, coal, oil, etc. You don't have this shift back to the private sector. So I'm also trying to understand why this shifts happen in one direction than the other. And so maybe to move forward, I would like to skip a few slides. We'll skip the next one. Very good. So I'll stop you. Let's skip that. Let's skip this one. That was India, but we'll skip that. Let's skip that again. Again. And yeah, this was the previous one was okay. So that's that's two strategies to deal with what wealth is generated by energy. Looking at the case of Norway and the United Kingdom. So basically the two countries discover gas and oil in the North Sea, more or less at the same period of time. One decides to keep this under public control, that's Norway, and they're going to create this sovereign wealth fund, which today amounts to more than 350,000 euros per adult in public wealth. And the UK decided to privatize this industry. And today they have -0 public wealth, which means that each Briton has more debts than it has assets because the government is indebted and its assets don't even cover their debt. So very different strategies to capture energy rents. And with this, Norway today is arguably in a much better position to decarbonize its economy. It's kind of paradoxical because they made a lot of that income through burning fossil fuels, but they also have a lot of public resources today. And so I'm going to skip the next slide and I'm going to, yeah, this one. So I started with the example of the streetcar scandal, which was, you know, when you have the private sector controlling capital in order to then impose a certain type of energy use. And so to prevent the reduction of energy demand in that case, because the private sector, at the time, General Motors, Standard Oil, really wanted everybody to maximize the use of the individual car. That's the counter example. I think this is really interesting. So these are energy sources used in Sweden in urban heating networks. So a heating network is what is a series of pipes connected on one side to a power plant, a heating plant, sorry. You're going to produce heat through maybe burning some wood that has been harvested, potentially in a sustainable way. Or you're going to reuse heat that's generated by an industry that was wasted. Instead of wasting it, you're reusing it, you're putting it in pipes, and then you're going to heat homes. And you can do the same thing more or less with, in fact, cooling. You could also have cooling heating systems. What I'm showing here is that the green part is the rise of biomass to heat for heating purposes in Sweden. So you see that before the 70s, heating in Sweden is very important, is essentially about fossil energy. That's the black lines. And today, more than 50% for all housing types is coming from biomass. And if you look at flats or housing lots with several houses in one lot, it's more than 90%. So this is a very important transition of the energy system, the heating system, and this was entirely engineered by municipalities. So that's local municipalities taking control of energy, producing heat for users, and also have a mandate from their constituencies to help them reduce their energy consumption. So again, here, owning capital matters. It can matter quite a bit for decarbonization, and it can matter quite a bit for how you're going to help users to reduce their consumption. So that's the counterexample to the streetcar scandal. And so then I'm going to conclude. I have quite a bit of slides to skip. So Nero, I'll just tell you when to stop. I'm going to skip all these slides with these colored graphs. That was to show you that diversity of energy mixes. I'm going to stop. I'm going to tell you. Yeah, you can go forward. Again, yeah. Again, and the next one. Yeah. Okay. So current period characterized by the rise of the global super rich. So that's the red curve. That's a stadium, basically 54,000 adults. They're owning 4% of global wealth in 1990s, owning close to 6%, 5.5% of global wealth today. That's 3 times more than everything that's owned by the entire bottom half of the world population. And so that's the paradox of today's situation, is that there's a lot of capital concentrated in a few hands. And there's a lot of investments that need to be made in the energy transition. And I'm going to skip the next slide and go and maybe finish on the next one. This one, yeah. And so this is projections which I make in the book, drawing from work with colleagues. So this is the top 1% wealth share, top 1% wealth owners. So here I'm not looking at this very, very small group. It's a slightly wider group, but it's still, the top of the global distribution of wealth. And you have two scenarios between now and 2050. In one scenario, you have a rise in the share of wealth accruing to the richest 1% of the world because they, in fact, have made all these energy investments. They make the investments, then they control all the solar panels, the electric battery systems, that the Muskian plan, basically, becoming reality. In the other scenario, the share of world's wealth owned by the top 1% drops to 26%. And in this scenario, basically what happens is that it's public actors, whether nations, whether local governments, or non-public but non-private, for-profit actors, non-private for-profit, so that's cooperative, who are going to make these investments and own the new energy capital through a wealth tax. There's a wealth tax that makes possible these things. And here you have a strong reduction of the global top 1% wealth share. So I'm going to conclude here and again skip a set of slides to get to the conclusion. Again, you can skip that. Maybe I can discuss this later on. You can skip again. And yeah, and so energy is key to inequality dynamics, to class conflicts. We've seen this over the past 150 years. I discussed this more at length in the book. What was interesting to see is that ambitious redistribution platforms in the 20th century, whether in Western Europe, I didn't talk so much in this discussion about India, but Nehruvian economics and politics is also about reclaiming power over energy. We can discuss this more at length. Whether in China, whether in North America, these redistribution platforms socialize energy in various ways. And in the context of decarbonization, this question comes back. And new forms of energy ownership can help keep inequality in check, accelerate the shift to low carbon energy. There's no optimal level between public, private, cooperative use, nothing that can come from, the calculus of any economist, engineer, or whatever. This is really a matter of public debates. New forms of collective and participatory ownership will probably be invented in the future. In any case, those who control energy in the 21st century will control societies and our abilities to decarbonize or not. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luca, for this very detailed discussion. We can raise points more also about India if we feel so.